Thank you, Rakesh.
Take the floor.
Okay, we're all ready. Welcome, everybody. Really pleased to have you here. Delighted to have Kate come to talk about her research that's about positive autistic identity. And I guess that's what everybody in the room wants to see. People who are self-accepting, enjoying life, and a community around them that supports, understands, and accepts each other. Okay, Kate,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to be here and to meet some of you. So the plan for today is that I'm going to be talking to you for about 45 minutes, and that every 15-ish minutes or so we'll stop and there'll be time for questions, so you don't have to hold on to those for too long. Just to tell you a tiny amount about me. So I'm a clinical psychologist by background. So I've worked in the NHS in like adult and predominantly child mental health settings, and mostly with neurodivergent young people, especially autistic young people, but I have worked with adults as well, and I am really interested in the transition to adulthood, so that's part of my research as well, but not so much what I'll be talking about today. Yeah, and I'm also an academic, so I do research at University College London. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the plan. These are the three sections about what I'm going to talk about today. So the first one is about autism as an identity, and I'm going to introduce social identity theory, which I think is a really useful way of thinking about identity for autistic people. And then the second part is going to be about well-being and what well-being means to autistic people in the words of autistic people. And then the third part, I'm going to tell you about my kind of future plans for my research. So I'm currently working on developing a well-being intervention for autistic teenagers. So be really interested to hear your thoughts on that. Next slide, please. Thank you. So why do I want to talk to you today about identity? Well, I should have said I'm not autistic myself, so I'm talking from my experience as a psychologist from working with lots of autistic people, but I don't have lived experience myself. But from talking to autistic people and their families, I've learnt that it can be really hard for some autistic people to know when it would be appropriate to talk about their autism and to disclose it. And the reality is that we live in a society where there can be stigma and difficulties when one is open about being different in lots of different ways, including being autistic. And we know that our mental health is influenced by how we feel about our identities. So autism is one identity, but there can be lots of other identities that you have, and I'll talk about that some more in a minute. And as I said, some autistic people do face stigma. There's a lot more public awareness about autism than there used to be, but clearly lots of autistic people face challenges, and that's borne out in kind of statistics around employment rates, in terms of mental health outcomes and physical health outcomes. So there's still lots more work that needs to be done. Obviously, in an ideal world, autistic people wouldn't be experiencing stigma, and I think there's lots of work to be done in terms of changing the environment and changing society. I suppose as a psychologist, my focus is more on how can we help individuals who have had these experiences. So I totally believe that societal change is really important and we need to see these cultural shifts. But at the same time, lots of autistic people I've worked with have already had those difficult experiences and need support to manage them. Can I check? Can you hear me okay at the back? Yeah, cool. Great. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, just thinking a little bit about identity and what identity is. So, within psychology, there are lots and lots of different theories about how we can understand ourselves and make sense of who we are, so what our identity is. And, yeah, exactly. I love that. So yes, the dog correctly identifies as a dog in that silly TikTok image that I've put on there. But there are lots of different ways that you can kind of define yourself, and I think it's really important that we have the opportunity to make sense of that. We also live in a society that is currently quite obsessed with identity and with labels, and I think that sometimes can put pressure on us to have a really strong sense of identity and really be able to label our identity. And I think we've moved towards a place where the yellow circle at the top, the sort of personal attributes part of identity, is really centred and really focused on in our current kind of culture. So things like, which generation do you belong to? So there's so much content, isn't there, about the difference between like Gen Z and Millennial and Gen X and Boomer. There's a lot of focus on the difference in people between age groups. And then obviously there's loads of thought about gender and how your gender identity influences your life. And also, you know, there's been lots of thinking about your ethnicity and how that influences your experiences, you know, with the recent Black Lives Matter protests and much more public consciousness about racism as well. So we're at this cultural moment where kind of personal attributes, I think, are a particularly important part of our identity. Another personal attribute, which I think there's much more awareness of than there used to be, is neurodiversity. So I think there was lots of focus on autism. I'm seeing lots more focus on ADHD in the media recently as well. So those attributes are often things that we find important ways to make sense of ourselves and who we are. Then you've also got values and beliefs. So belonging to a certain religion, having certain political views, and other kind of core values that influence the way that you live your life can be a very important way of seeing ourselves and making sense of our identity. And then also your actual actions and the way that you spend your time. So your work or education can be really important. So I spent lots of time training to be a clinical psychologist. That's my part of my job, and so that's an important identity for me because it's something I invested a lot of time and effort into. And then also hobbies and interests. So the way that you spend your free time can be a really important part of how you see yourself. Next slide, please. Thank you. So that was personal identity, but social identity is about who do we relate to. And there's lots and lots of overlap between the sorts of identity that I just told you about and how we relate to other people. But just because you have a personal identity doesn't necessarily mean that you relate to other people in that group. So, you know, you might be in a particular generation. You know, you might be Gen X, but you don't really identify with other people in that same generation as you particularly. Or you might have a gender identity, but not really feel much of a connection to people in that group. So your social identity doesn't always just map on to your sort of personal identity. Another example would be, I've met autistic people who tell me that actually they don't especially want to hang out with other autistic people, although the majority of autistic people I've met do see autism as an important social identity where they do feel that sense of connection to other autistic people. So just giving an example of a kind of values or belief-based identity, if you're a member of, if you've got a value around the environment and you're really concerned and worried about the environment, that might be a personal value-based identity. But then if you're also a member of an activist group like Extinction Rebellion, and you really identify with other members of that group, then it becomes a social identity as well. And then similarly, you might have a hobby being really into gaming, and that might be something that can become a social identity if you really feel that sense of connection with other gamers. So next slide, please. So this might be what gaming would look like if it's a personal identity. So it might be something that you spend a lot of time doing by yourself. It might be a really important way that you think about yourself, that gaming is a really core, central part of who you are, but maybe you don't really feel that you need to see other gamers and hang out with other gamers, so it's a personal identity. Next slide, thanks. Whereas if gaming's a social identity, it might look something more like this. And I'm so sorry for this image. I think it's probably quite obvious from this that I don't necessarily do gaming myself, but it's hard to find open access images for presentations. But if you do gaming as a social identity, it might look more like this. So you're spending time with other people who are really into gaming and into the same things as you are. And you really, when you meet someone who's a gamer, you feel that sense of connection to them because you've got that hobby in common. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Does anyone have any questions at this point? Okay, cool. Next slide, please. So I think it's really important at this point, because I'm obviously talking a lot about identity, to be really clear that you get to choose a lot of the time the identities that kind of guide your choices and what you do. And although society can put a lot of pressure on you to kind of adhere to stereotypes or norms around the groups that you belong to, you can be in charge of them, and a lot of identities can be fluid and change over time, and the way that you identify with them can change over time, and that's okay. I think at the moment we're at a point where we can think in quite a rigid way about identities, and I think that can be quite constraining for people sometimes, actually, to feel that, you have to really say, this is who I am, and that's not going to change. And I think I've certainly worked with a lot of young people who have actually been quite distressed at this idea that they should be able to label themselves very clearly and very precisely in lots of different ways, and actually they're not quite there yet, and they're not really sure who they are yet, and it can be upsetting to feel that they're not quite getting it right by not being able to say, this is exactly who I am. Next slide. Thanks. So, going back to focusing on autism as an identity, so obviously the way that we think about autism has changed a lot over the years, and I think autism has gone from being something that a medical professional diagnoses and is kind of seen as a medicalized condition that a doctor gives to you, to something which is often taken on as a personal identity. And I've certainly had the experience working in autism diagnostic clinics where people have come and they've already got a really strong identity as an autistic person, although they haven't had the diagnosis yet. So I think we've seen this sort of separation between diagnosis and identity. And I think sometimes we can feel positively about having a certain identity, but sometimes we don't, and that can vary depending on our age. It can depend on recent experiences that we've had. It can depend on how much stigma you faced because of an identity. But I've certainly met a lot of autistic people who have mixed feelings about being autistic. I've met some autistic people who have only positive feelings and some who have only negative feelings, but I would say the majority of people that I've spoken to have quite mixed feelings. And I think it is really normal to not know when to disclose to other people whether or not you are autistic. A lot of people I've met really worry that disclosing being autistic might influence the way that other people treat them in a negative way, especially in workplace settings where there can be discrimination when you act differently to the kind of norm within the workplace. So it's really understandable that people kind of try and think quite carefully about when and how to share being autistic. And I think people, whether consciously or unconsciously, will choose different strategies to manage having an autistic identity. So next slide, thanks. So let's have a think then about how to understand these different strategies that people might use to manage an autism identity in particular. So social identity theory it's been a theory in psychology for a long time. You can see the citation there is from the 70s. And social identity theory is about the fact that as humans, we like to put ourselves into social groups and we like to define ourselves as belonging to those groups. That's sort of a thing that happens very naturally. And an example of that would be gender. So if you watch small children on a playground, kind of 4 or 5-year-olds interacting with each other, you will notice that on the whole, the boys will play together and the girls will play together. Even with all the like fluidity and changes to gender norms, that still is very often the case. And if you talk to a young girl about how she feels about boys, she'll often be like, no, gross, don't want to hang out with the boys. So there's this sense of, you've got your in-group, we call it. And so the in-group might be your gender group. It can be lots of other things as well. But this is a kind of natural process that starts happening from when we're quite small. Next slide. Oh, and could you click another 2 times? Thank you. Great. Perfect. So I think it's quite blurry, this, but I wanted to show you this data because this is from a research project which was led by a trainee psychologist at the University of Bath called Ros Cooper, no relation to me. And we asked lots of autistic people to list different words that they associated with autism. And this is a list of the top 10 words that came out. And we then rated them as to whether they were seen as kind of positive attributes or negative attributes. So you can see that there were 3 out of the 10 words here that were seen as being positive words. So those were words like gifted and unique. But then there were 7 words that were rated as being kind of, there were 6 that were rated as being negative, and then there was 1 that was neutral. And the ones that were seen as negative were sensory issues, loneliness, anxiety, words like that. So what that suggests from this data is that lots of autistic people do think about negative experiences and words linked to autism, but there are positives as well. So that speaks to the sort of mixed feelings that I mentioned earlier about being autistic, and I think also speaks to the reality of the strengths and challenges that come along with being autistic. I think there's a risk of trying to pretend that there aren't challenges, and I think that can make a lot of autistic people feel like they're not being listened to and not being heard when we only think about positives or we only think about challenges. Next slide, please. Great. So, from thinking from a social identity theory perspective, if you belong to a group where there is stigma and where sometimes you do have negative experiences because of belonging to that group, there are different strategies which you can use. Now, when I say strategy, I don't mean that like someone has a big board at home and they're like mapping out exactly what they're going to do. I mean ways that people react to having that identity, and it might not be something that they're aware of doing, but it's just something that happens. You know, we kind of get into habits to manage our everyday lives. So I think sometimes people get caught up on that. But one option from the social identity theory perspective is that you try and distance yourself from the group. So I have met lots of autistic people who decide that they're not going to disclose that they're autistic. They don't really want to spend much time with other autistic people, and they're actually going to focus on other identities. So maybe they're a student and they're going to really focus on that identity and make that a really important part of who they are, rather than focusing on autism, which is a completely reasonable strategy to use. Next slide, please. Another kind of strategy is kind of having this pride in being autistic, or maybe having this balanced identity that I've been talking about, so being able to acknowledge both the strengths and the challenges. And, you know, I think, and I keep saying this, but in recent years it's been so lovely to see that there has been this big increase in awareness of autism and pride in the strengths that can come with being autistic. So like on social media, you get the Actually Autistic hashtag, where lots of autistic people are talking to each other and talking about strengths and challenges. And there's a quote from a questionnaire that I use sometimes. I think that autistic people have lots to be proud of. And when you think about what someone like Greta Thunberg has achieved, the Swedish climate activist, and she attributes so much of her drive and passion to being autistic, you can see that there are real strengths that do come with being autistic. So this is another thing that you can do to kind of cope with having an identity that is sometimes stigmatized by other people. It's let's focus on the positives, let's see the strengths. Next slide, please. And could you click again? Thank you. So this is a paper by Catherine Crompton, who's at Edinburgh University, and I just shared it because I really think this quote at the top is helpful. So it says, "I never realised everybody felt as happy as I do when I'm around other autistic people." So this is a sense of feeling pride in being autistic and feeling connected and happy when you're around other autistic people. And I used to help with a summer school for autistic students at the University of Bath. It was before they started university for the first time. So they'd all made it all the way through school and managed to get grades that meant that they had a place to study at university. And a lot of those 17, 18-year-olds would say this summer school was the first time they'd ever met another autistic person, or at least known that they were meeting another autistic person. And they just loved it. You could see people just breathing a sigh of relief and just feeling so happy to have those connections. So I think that kind of sense of connection and identity with other autistic people can be really profound and really important for some people, especially when you're at a stage where you're trying to make sense of yourself and understand your identity, like teenagers and young adults are particularly often doing. Next slide. Okay, this is a very wordy slide. But recently I was involved in this review of all of the evidence, all of the scientific evidence that's been done so far, and we wanted to find out, is having a positive autism identity associated with better mental health and better well-being? And almost all the evidence that we have does point in that direction. So it's not super high quality evidence, but all of the research that has been done so far really does suggest that people who have higher autism acceptance, so they've kind of accepted that as part of who they are, who feel more of a connection to other autistic people, and who feel positively about that connection are likely to have better well-being and mental health. So it kind of supports this idea that having a positive autism identity is good for you. Next. Oh yeah, question.
How early we can kind of try to understand the person or the child can be autistic?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it completely depends on their kind of developmental stage, which doesn't necessarily correspond to their age, because your development can look very different. But I think when you're thinking about a younger child or someone who doesn't have as much of a developed sense of self, then a lot of how you would be helping them have a positive identity is through parenting or caring and how the kind of environment is set up to help them accept themselves. So things like not telling them off for stimming or flapping or doing anything like that. So there's this kind of implicit sense of acceptance of who they are, because you're not going to be able to help like a small child understand their sense of self. I think when they head towards adolescence and they have more of a sense of being an individual and they're starting to grapple a little bit more with how they fit in with other people, maybe noticing that they are a little bit different, I think that's when you can start having more concrete conversations with them about that and trying to help them make sense of what it is to be different. And then I think as they move into like mid-adolescence, a conversation that I used to have with kind of teenagers a lot who were autistic was helping them make sense of the cruelty of other young people as not being about them, but being about other people being unhappy, but also giving them the sense, because teenagers feel very trapped, and in a lot of ways they are very trapped. They don't have very much choice about where they live and how they spend their time. I think just reminding them that it won't be like this forever, and at some point they will have a lot more freedom about their social life. And I think so many autistic people do flourish when they're able to find their niche and find whatever community it is that really works for them, whether it's creative people, you know, other gamers or whatever it is that they're interested in. But that obviously takes time and having a bit more freedom outside of the school setting. Often. Yeah, I feel like I could keep talking about that for a long time, but
it's quite difficult to, even with the person or within a family, to identify. I feel like it is really challenging to find the person in the family or it is yourself. You do not know exactly.
So to find the person who can support that sort of work, do you mean?
How do you know like, the person is autistic?
Oh, I see.
To identify, no, because as you said, like
Yeah.
you do not agree, like even example, like if I say someone you could be autistic, even though I'm from the same family, so you cannot just say like
Yeah.
the teachers or anybody can help to identify.
Yeah, well, I would say that kind of going through the assessment process, if that's if that's indicated by, teachers and educational staff, can be a really important part of the journey, because obviously if you start helping someone make sense of being autistic but they haven't got that label yet, that can be very confusing if they then go through the diagnostic process and don't get that label. And I've definitely had that experience myself where I've worked with a young person, done a diagnostic assessment and haven't given them the autism diagnosis because they didn't meet the criteria as they're written in the diagnostic manual, and then that's really upsetting for the young person. So I think it is something that needs to be thought through carefully when we're getting that diagnosis.
It's quite challenging.
It's really challenging, especially at the moment. Yeah, it is really challenging.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions whilst we're...
Do you know what I'm going to ask?
Go on.
And everyone that knows me is going to go, oh shit, she's off. But when you're talking about autism identity, I'm 60 now, so I've lived it. All right, I've done my 10,000 hours. I just find I'm a human being, and that's enough.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be about you belong in this group. Every single billion person on this planet is different.
Yeah.
And I'm different, and I get on with certain people, and I don't get on with other people. You noticed as a child that they're not something different. Some people call it quirky, the flappy hands thing when they're happy or they're angry or frustrated. I find that being autistic isn't an identity. It's not.
Yeah.
It's just you're different from someone else. You have strengths, you have weaknesses, like everyone else. I just find, I was at the doctor's this morning giving blood and they asked your ethnic thing, and I've always just put down human being. And it's enough. It's enough.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be categorising or being with other people. My son's autistic and he was in college in Reading, and they were in a group of, the class was all autistic, and there's a kid that taps. Drove my son mad every single minute he was in the class and had to absorb it, otherwise the issue is his, rather than, I find groups are not necessarily, I know you put it into gaming, but it's also like football supporters. That's a tribe. Some are nice, some are absolutely awful in that tribe, same as anyone else. But when you were saying at college or schools, they meet each other. But it's nice to acknowledge.
Yeah.
I know who you are without you going into all the details. You're autistic, I'm autistic. You've got your quirks, I've got my quirks. We can go on, but neurotypicals can come into that. And some neurotypicals are absolute arseholes. They make your life more complicated. I think when it comes to school for younger kids, a lot of them have the sensory issues, nerve damage. When the bullying starts, and it's not addressed, the teachers see the reaction, not the action. So when a child is, you hit me, it's you that's causing the problem because you're making a noise. The bullies are never taken away and they're a target. And I find in younger schools, and even, not so much in colleges, but very much primary schools, once those neurotypical bullies, like they've got a problem, and people who are angry, people who fight, have to fight at home kind of thing, That's the issue, and I think it's so important in primary school where they look after that child. It's meant to be a place of safety, and most of the time it's not. And once the bullying starts and the trauma starts, and then that's attached to the child as it gets older, through whatever. And I know it's sort of nice, go to college, meet someone who you're autistic, I'm autistic, and we're all happy. It's not quite right. That's not quite what happens. You just associate to someone who's has the same values as you.
Yeah.
Politics and religion don't really come into it. No, your politics and your religion are usually your parents, which are handed down that you listen to as you grow up, kind of thing. But anyway, yeah, I'm good.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Sorry. Sorry.
Sorry, I think that there have been huge cultural shifts in how we think about ourselves. And
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry again. Oh. I don't know if any of you know Dr. Vince, who's a very good autistic and pain specialist. And he was saying to me years ago, and I've lost contact with him, he's gone off to other regions, that they were starting to say that autism is being born with trauma and the effects of nerve damage, sensory issues, and whatever. And I've not really heard, I've got profound PTSD, childhood crap and whatever, but it's an amalgamation. It's, you have to cope with this, but you've got this, you've got this. But what I would also say about, once people find out that you're autistic, I have Asperger's like myself, they regard you as stupid, that you're non-intelligent and whatever you say is of a nothing. You can speak to a specialist who's read books and got their degrees and whatever, you can tell them in your own words and express it really well, but then they would interpret it completely differently. This is what I think you're saying. No, I said what I was saying, you just weren't listening. You put it down as something else, and I think it gets missed all the time.
yeah.
How we're regarded as stupid.
Which is awful.
Yeah.
Which is awful.
Yeah, in the workplace,
Yeah.
and when you speak up, but they're autistic, they don't know what they're saying. So you're never listened to or given the credence that you should be. Again,
Sorry, you've had experience. Yeah.
I think we all have,
Yeah.
There is more and more understanding these days regarding autism and neurodivergent comparatively. You're absolutely right. As we were younger, things were different. There were labels like stupid, silly, dumb, loser, and all those things. Now there's more awareness and acceptance day by day.
but they're still bullies.
Because they're
Looking for someone that's
because
different.
they're the older generation, because that's how they've been nurtured. But the newer
Yes,
ones, the
yeah.
new generation is more tolerant, and you will see a change very soon.
Yeah. But there's nothing really about the autistic kids being tolerant towards the neurotypicals.
No,
you know?
which is needed. I'm going to get back to my
Yes,
slides.
sorry, sorry.
No, it's fine, don't be sorry. They're really interesting, important points. But I think we're going to have time for a discussion between the autistic audience members at the end, so I think we'll have more time to sit at the end. Grand. Oh, we're on to the next slide. Great. So just to round off this section, I think we're towards the end of this section. Just thinking about some kind of potential pros and cons of disclosing being autistic in different settings. And again, these come from conversations that I've had with lots of autistic people. So obviously, a big reason for asking for an autism assessment and diagnosis is to get more support. And there obviously are laws that mean that autistic people should receive reasonable adjustments and get support. And it might mean that people are more understanding of difficulties and differences that you have. It also means if you're interested in finding other autistic people, it's possible, because, if you don't mention it, then it might be harder to find other autistic people. It could help other people so that they know they're not the only person having similar experiences, although, of course, every autistic person is different from one another. And yeah, it can give you legal protections as well. But then, we can't control how other people will respond. I've spoken to lots of people who have had experiences of feeling really let down or invalidated by other people when they do disclose that they're autistic. And it can feel like quite an awkward thing to bring up with other people as well, so some people struggle.
Sorry, I have school run.
Oh, okay, it's lovely to meet you. Bye. Bye. And so you can't guarantee that it will lead to positive changes, although there are legal protections that mean that some changes should happen. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on to the second section now. Was anyone holding on to any questions till the question section that I said would come up? Does anyone want to ask anything about what we've just been talking about?
Well, just one thing, you said about the legal
Yes.
requirements of reasonable adjustments. Well, the only reasonable adjustment I've come across is within the NHS.
Yeah.
Is
So
there
in the
anything
workplace, they are obliged to make those sorts of adjustments. So yeah, kind of, there are quite a few different settings where, like educational help, like
My son's an adult, he's autistic years,
right.
so it's all very adjustment. And that's the only one that I've come across.
So sorry, did you say your son doesn't have a diagnosis?
He doesn't have a
No,
diagnosis.
yeah.
Because he went through special needs school, he's never had a diagnosis.
Yeah.
He's always been dyspraxic. But what I'm saying, the only reasonable adjustments I've ever come across is in hospital.
Yeah, and I think
that
something.
was retrospective.
Yeah, I think something that people often say to me as well is that they'll be asked what reasonable adjustments they want to be made. So an employer sometimes will say to someone, okay, you disclosed you're autistic, what reasonable adjustments do you want? Lots of autistic people say to me, I don't know what reasonable adjustment I need. I need some help to work, you always need to have some sessions with an occupational health person to work out what adjustments you might need, because a big open question like that, like what can we do for you, is actually quite difficult to answer as well. So even when they are offered, sometimes they're not offered in a way that people can take advantage of them. So yeah, there's
The
definitely
only
work.
example I had was in A&E, which is very noisy, very busy,
Yeah.
very aggressive, and there was a private room, we weren't told about it, even though I had a mental health.
So it wasn't really adjusted anyway, really.
It will be in future because the hospital classes are now.
Good. Yeah, the hospitals are in the work. Yes.
Sorry, I just had a question in regards to the personal identity and then the social identity.
Yes.
So you gave me as an example, and as a personal identity, wanting to do it alone, doing that alone, opposed to doing it in a group setting. Are there circumstances where the lack of socialisation or struggle in social situations, which is something that can be common with people with autism, could hinder the transition from a personal identity going into a social identity? And if so, how can we support the young people to make that change, / do they even need to make that change from personal to social?
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely think that it can be more challenging for autistic people to make those kinds of personal identities become a social identity. I think that support, like providing structure and support for that, can be really helpful. So there's a lot more work being done in like social prescribing at the moment, so kind of really formalised support to help someone get into the sorts of social situations that they want to. But it depends on the individual. Some people will feel a sense of social affiliation and connection without actually spending very much time with that community. So, it's not actually about amount of contact with the people, it's about how you feel about belonging to that group. So you have to ask someone, is this a group that you want to spend more time with? Do you feel a sense of connection with them? Do you want to feel more of a sense of connection with them? And then work based on their needs. Because I think it's very, I'm a non-autistic psychologist, it's been very easy for me to make assumptions about what someone might want in their social life. I think you have to go based on their experience.
So could you just clarify what social prescribing means?
Yeah, so social prescribing is kind of a new-ish intervention, which is probably just doing some very old school things, but it's meeting with someone and looking at their kind of current social network and how they're spending time, where there are gaps where they'd like to be more involved. So, sometimes it can be helping people do volunteering or kind of finding particular social groups that they want to get involved in, so helping them find like daily social activities that will benefit their well-being. It's very broad, actually.
And social prescribers also connect you to different charities or different departments. For example, if you're not able to pay a certain bill, you're finding it overwhelmed, or you're not able to fill up forms, so they connect you to various different departments. I think it's absolutely amazing social prescriber, and you get a reference through your GP, just in case that you would ever like some extra support.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on. So next slide, please. So this section I'm going to talk about well-being, and I'm going to talk about another review of evidence where we looked at all of the scientific papers which have been published, which actually spoke to autistic young people specifically and asked their viewpoints on what makes them feel good, what gives them this sense of well-being. So when I say well-being, I mean feeling good and feeling like you're living the life you want to live, that you're doing things that you find to be meaningful with your life. So yeah, we searched for all of the papers that did these sorts of interviews with autistic young people and their families. Next slide, please. And another wordy slide, but basically we found 37 papers that mostly had been published in the last few years. So it shows that researchers only recently really started asking autistic people about their experiences. But I'm glad that there's lots more of that research now. And the papers that we included were for young people aged between 10 and 24 years, so trying to capture kind of adolescence into young adulthood. Next slide, please. I'm aware of time, I'm going over. So, I know that's quite small. There'll be zoomed in versions of this image as we go through, but we analysed all of the findings from this paper, and this is a summary of our findings. So there were three main themes that we found. So the first one was to be able to grow, I also need rest. The second one was seeing myself positively around other people, and the third one was about feeling good. And I'm very lucky that I work with this brilliant autistic artist called Andy Thornton, so he's made the summary of the research findings. So I'm very grateful to Andy for his amazing work. So next slide, please. So the first theme was called to be able to grow, I also need rest. And the first part of that was about growing in my own way. So a lot of the autistic young people said that they really wanted to feel a sense of progression, growing, development, but that they wanted to be given some autonomy to do it their own way. And they sometimes felt that adults were trying to push them in certain directions that they didn't feel ready for, or they didn't feel that they were choosing themselves. So there's a quote from a young person here that says, "Being active is the only time where I feel free. Free from always being told what to do, how to do it, when to do it. Free from teachers, therapists and parents telling me how to live my life. Free from doing the same routine of school, home, doing homework, being a loner, getting beat up." So there's a sense of them really wanting to have their freedom to grow in their own way. Next slide, please. Thank you. But actually, next slide again, because we're running out of time. Great. So the second part of this theme was about I need to be comfortable and I need to rest. So there was this sense of, yeah, I need to grow, but I can't grow unless you give me time to recharge and rest in a really autism-friendly way. So I love this image because the young person's got their sensory needs covered with their headphones and also their games and their familiar, comfortable objects. And you can see that they're recharging. So this quote was from a young person about their experience of the pandemic, actually. So there was a paper about how autistic young people experienced the pandemic, and I know that was a hugely challenging period for lots of people, but there were benefits that lots of autistic people spoke about in particular. So this young person was saying about not going into school, I'm calmer and I don't get angry anymore because I'm less tired and there's not so much noise, nobody touches me or says things I don't want to hear. I like it a lot. I sit at home and I don't have to go to school. I just have my lessons on the computer and classes too, remedial classes and normal classes. So this young person felt that they were actually able to recharge and rest a lot without being in that overwhelming sensory environment of school. Next slide, please. And next one again. Thank you. So the second theme was about seeing myself positively around other people. And I think it's worth noting at this point that, of course, these are themes that would come up for non-autistic young people as well, right? So these are things that autistic people brought up, but I'm sure most teenagers would say similar things. Coming back to your point, actually, about being a human. So the first part of seeing myself positively around other people was this need to understand the ways in which you're different, because it's hard to see yourself positively if you don't understand how and why you're different from other people your age. So I just love this image. I don't know if you can read it, but it's somebody's morning routine, an autistic young person's morning routine. So it says, breakfast eaten, tick, friend replied to, homework sorted, new frog fact memorised, and morning routine complete. Which I just think is lovely. So, you know, really accepting your differences, your special interest in frogs in this case. And there's a quote from a young person who really did feel that connection to other autistic people and for whom it was a really important thing to be around other autistic people. So they said, it's amazing what it does to have a group of people your own age in the same situation, just going through the same stuff that you are. We all tick the same things, literally. We all use the phrase of speech and everyone will look at us like, what? And we'll be like, yeah, that's totally us. So you can see how this young person is really enjoying feeling connected to other autistic people. Okay, next slide. And then the second part is having social connections and being accepted by others. So you can see that most of the people at the party there are kind of drinking and dancing, but then you've got the three maybe neurodivergent young people there who are gaming, and they feel that sense of connection to each other, but doing something quite different to everybody else at the party. And there's a quote there from an autistic young person with a learning disability who said that friends are really important. So friends make me happy, are always there for me, and are awesome and hold a special place in my heart. So the sense that social connection and feeling that other people value you and accept you is really important. Next slide, please. And then the final theme about what makes autistic young people feel good is doing things I love. And obviously we know that a big part of autism is having these strong, passionate interests that can be really rewarding and really enrich your life. And so you can see here that there's a young person with a love of dogs. And then there's a quote from a young person who loves trains from one of the studies. So they said, it's something that I love. It also makes the sounds that I love to hear. Railroads would be the one thing that represents my well-being. I'd improve my well-being by travelling across the country by train. So, next slide, please. And then the last part is about how those positive feelings in your body can actually be really enhanced by sensory experiences and sensory sensitivity. So, of course, having sensory differences can come along with challenges and feeling overwhelmed in certain environments like school, but actually it can enhance pleasure of some things. So I really love this image because Andy, the artist, said that when he was growing up, his mum would despair because he would have the longest showers sitting down because he just loved the feeling of the water on his body, and it was a really lovely sensory experience that he enjoyed and maybe enjoyed more than somebody without sensory sensitivities would enjoy. And then there's a quote from a young person who really likes swimming in cold water. So they've said, swimming in cold water relaxes me and refreshes, my spirit and my mind. It's just, just jump into the water, freezing cold water. Your body just adapts to the temperature. So they really enjoy that sensory experience. It enriches their life. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've started speeding up a little bit because I was aware we were behind schedule. But hopefully that's given you a picture of what lots of autistic people say makes their lives better, what makes them feel good. And I suppose, like I say, it's similar to non-autistic young people, but it involves an awareness of the differences that come along with being autistic and sort of harnessing those to increase well-being. And I just think that's really important because there's so much talk about how being autistic decreases well-being, and there's lots and lots and lots of thinking about that. But there are also really important ways that we can use the features of autism to enhance well-being too. Does anyone have any questions about that section? No. Stunned silence. Okay, well, I don't.
Really interesting, I think. I think really fascinating. I wish we had more people from early years and kids and transition services here to learn about this. Because most of the people here are adults
Yeah.
or. So it's great to know there's better things coming.
I know, and do you know what? I've had those conversations quite a lot because a lot of my work has been kind of lifespan or developing mental health interventions for adults. But I've moved a little bit more towards doing work with teenagers and young adults, and I think that can be the reason for that is that we know that doing early intervention can improve outcomes later down the line, but that can be really frustrating for people who are well past that life stage as well. So I totally appreciate that can be a challenge. Yeah. The next section is about developing an intervention for teenagers. So would it be best to stop there, or shall I tell you a little bit about? Who would like to hear about me developing an intervention for teenagers?
Will we
Okay.
share the plan?
Yes.
Once Kate has done her talk,
Yeah.
the idea is that autistic people will stay and then talk to Kate.
If you want to.
If you want to,
It's
obviously.
like, anyone want a bail? Is that?
Yeah, of course, yeah. But it's just to have an opportunity for actually autistic people to.
Do we have to finish now? Are we on a time limit?
No, I'm gonna keep going because some
Okay.
people do want to. I've only got a few more slides, but there was a question about.
So I was just wondering, for the people that are going to stay that have autism and that conversation, are those that don't have autism able to sit and listen, or is it that we?
Oh, the question was, can non-autistic people stay and listen to the conversation?
Entirely up to the autistic people.
Because it's
Maybe
We
can have a
talked
vote on
about that in a bit.
Okay. Autistic people maybe have a think about how you
Yeah.
feel about that. I'll present the last few slides unless there's any other questions about the well-being bit.
Can I just say,
Yeah.
because you're going on to something different,
I am. Yeah.
the well-being, personal, what I found and what I would say to anyone, find comedy. When you find comedy, then you're laughing and you have the endorphins. There's podcasts out there now, so find your age. And she does swear, but comedy is a real well-being thing that you can be listening to. You don't need other people around you. And if you find the comedy, you also find the comedy in your humour with someone else. It gives you the confidence that you know when you've got good friends, you can just say something and they know what you mean, and you can have that. But even if you're on your own and you know with nothing to do, if you're just listening to a comedian or other comedians, you will just feel okay rather than feeling down.
Yeah.
So find a bit of humour in your lives.
I agree. Some young people do talk about how important it is
Yeah.
to laugh. Yeah.
Yes, just going back to, I think it was the earlier section. So what do you recommend in terms of promoting positive identity?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think, depending on the individual, actually coming together with other autistic people can be a really important way of learning about that. So I think kind of peer support groups are useful. I would say we don't really have very much evidence actually from autistic people about that. So that's something that I'm working on, and I'll talk about it in a minute. We can kind of guess from social identity theory where being in social group settings with other group members does increase that sense of belonging and group kind of feelings of group membership helps. And with autism, you need to know what autism is about to be able to facilitate it.
Just on that
Yeah.
point, if the assumption is that autistic people are already in kind of social setting, is that not indicative that it would correlate with what is the social identity theory?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the fact that a lot of like grassroots organisations do create these groups for people to come together, and it is indicative of something that we want to help other language. there's been a lot of focus on kind of parents and supporting schools and a lot less focus actually, especially well, for autistic people of all ages, actually putting that support for the actual individual. Any other questions on the identity or wellbeing stuff? We're on the home run now, just to present a little bit about what I'm doing at the moment. So next slide, please. Oh, sorry, that doesn't show up very well, but basically I'm just at the beginning of a more than 6-year research project where I'm going to be developing these wellbeing groups for autistic teenagers. So it's focused on 11 to 16-year-olds, but I have also been working on a separate project which is for 16 to 25-year-olds. So my research is really moving into focusing on that age group. And I'm basically drawing on the evidence base through the reviews that I've mentioned today. So I've took you through the beautiful illustrations from the wellbeing review that I did, and then I told you very briefly about the social identity literature review. So that means I'm pulling on lots of different research studies. And I've done the first steps of speaking to autistic young people and their families about what an intervention like this should look like. But I'm, over the next 6 years, I'm going to be working much more on that. So I wanted to tell you just a little bit about my plans to develop the groups. So next slide, please. So, sorry, it's another very wordy slide, but because I'm at the beginning, these are all potential ideas, and I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. But the idea is that at the moment, autistic teenagers don't have very much opportunity to make sense of having that diagnosis and to kind of learn what autism is and also think about how to navigate the challenges of living in a world which is dominated by non-autistic people, where it can be very difficult to feel different to other people and to make sense of those experiences. And we know from the review that I just told you about that, it's really important that autistic young people feel socially connected and valued by other people. So how can they make sense of difficulties and difficult experiences? So the plan for the groups is that there'll be online sessions, which young people said they preferred to in-person because it means they can be at home when they attend. And there's going to be hour-long sessions where they meet in groups with other autistic young people, so trying to enhance that sense of autism social identity. But it can't be boring, right? How are you going to get like a 12-year-old autistic child to sit on an hour-long call without just turning their video off, disengaging? So the conclusion that we've come to together is that it might be like a tabletop role player style game. So Dungeons and Dragons would be an example of that. And I have to admit, complete ignorance. So I'm desperately trying to learn about gaming at the moment, but it is not my thing at all. So that's a real challenge for me. It's on my to-do list at the moment to learn more about tabletop games. But the idea is that the game would be a way of learning about the features of autism. So they'd create like an avatar which they would be using through the game, and that would be an opportunity to learn about the features of autism. And then there would be a sort of journey through different lands. So the first one would be the land of autism, where they'll have challenges like building a kind of sensory environment that makes lots of sense for them. There'll be like device plots to make that much more exciting. Plot devices, sorry. And then they're going to move on to the land of neurotypicals, where, there'll be challenges like there'll be a place where everyone's always talking, like using small talk. You have to use small talk to access the clubhouse or whatever it is. And so like using plot devices to help the young person think about how do I navigate these like tricky social situations. It's not social skills training. It's how do I make sense of that and kind of navigate it in a way that feels true to myself. So an opportunity to explore kind of social difficulties in a game format rather than being like, you have to act in this certain way to fit in. And then the last section will be working together with the neurotypical characters in the game to kind of build this new land that is adapted and works for autistic people, but also neurotypical people. people. So thinking about how to meet your social needs in this world where there's lots of neurotypical people, but autistic people too. So hopefully developing a new way of thinking about themselves and their identity through this game in a way that feels fun and accessible and not too intimidating. But I'm literally right at the beginning of this process, so I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on that. Next slide, please. Sorry, these colours aren't working on the screen very well, but what I'm planning to do over the next few years is I'm really lucky. I work with this team of all autistic researchers, so they're all PhD researchers and autistic themselves, and they're really brilliant. And one of them is really into Dungeons and Dragons, so they're helping me work up the session plans for how the intervention is going to look. And then I'm obviously also working with researchers and clinicians and parents as well who have experience. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. Then I'm going to work with the artist who did the pictures that you saw before. So he's going to develop some resources, some images of what the different islands will look like. He's really into Dungeons and Dragons too, so he's really helping me understand the gaming side of it. And then what I'm going to do towards the end of this year is start piloting the groups with different autistic young people and sort of improving it and updating it and then running it again and getting feedback from lots of different people. So other autistic young people, autistic adults who might have quite a different perspective, clinicians, parents, a really wide group of people. So I'll be running those groups a few times and getting feedback from people. And then I'm going to start running a randomised control trial, which is a big study where I'll be trying to work out, eventually in a very long time, does this help improve well-being? Is this a useful thing to do? Because as I was saying earlier in answer to that question, we actually don't know yet. We have lots of evidence that makes us think this could be really helpful, but ultimately to get this sort of thing used by local authorities or the NHS, we need evidence and we need to have trials to show that it works. So in a long time, that's what I hope we'll be able to do. Next slide, please. So that is all of my talking. Sorry, we've gone over the time that I said we would, but you've asked lots of really interesting questions. So there's now an opportunity for anyone who wants to ask a question, to ask questions, and then we've also got the room booked until 4, I think, for autistic people if you want to stay and have a smaller group discussion. Yeah.
I've got a couple of comments.
Yeah.
So I'm an autistic woman.
Yeah.
I would hate this gaming thing.
Yeah.
As a child, I would not have been interested whatsoever. It seems you're targeting one specific identity, autistic, neurodivergent people that are into gaming.
Yeah, well,
And only then. That's coming.
And the gamers don't like that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, that's very helpful feedback to have. I suppose the options are either it's sort of like a lesson-based thing or it's a game-based thing. Would you rather a lesson-based thing, do you think, about age?
Personally, yes.
Yeah.
Have you read Fern Brady's Strong Female Character?
I'm halfway through, actually.
Okay, because she talks about the transition from,
Yeah.
well, she kind of left school into a secure uni, but the transition into university and arriving at university
Yeah.
and not understanding even how to write an essay,
Yeah.
not understanding how to ask questions. So if you're looking at well-being, it's almost like there's a bridge that needs to be gapped between school and university
Totally.
for autistic students to navigate.
Yeah, so I'm working on this other project at the moment, which is trying to do a similar thing, but for 16 to 25-year-olds. And actually that course runs much more like lessons, so it's much more standardised. And I agree with you. I think there will be some people who don't want to do the game thing. And what I hope in the longer term is that we might be able to adapt the intervention for 16 to 25-year-olds, which is more like lessons for the younger age group as well. But I think from the work that I've done so far, more young people that age say they'd rather play a game than say that they'd want to do the lesson side of things. But I am going to be refining it, like I said, over those, like running a pilot, getting feedback, running a pilot.
Yeah.
So when I do that, lots of the young people say to me, we hate this game thing, then it won't be a game,
Yeah,
basically.
I'm just conscious that I personally,
Yeah, yeah.
in my autistic social identity, I don't know if anyone who does
Yeah.
gaming.
You don't have to be a gamer.
No, I know, but like the women's group and other people that I interact with, none
Yeah.
of them are gamers.
But you don't have to be a gamer to do this. I mean, it's going to be...
There would be an interest.
No,
Yeah.
can I just say,
Yeah.
I can't. The thing with that is, and I completely agree, I heard what
It's
you
great
said.
that everybody's talking. Can I just, Sarfraz wants to make an announcement.
Oh, yeah.
And if the autistic people are all talking, so can he jump in and do the announcement?
And neither am I.
No, can I just add on to that? When you were saying you were going to, at the very beginning, when you're going to be a character,
Yeah, yeah.
a lot of autistic people don't like to pretend, don't like to lie, don't like to make things up.
Yeah, yeah.
So instinctively, the first thing you've said is like, oh, I've got to pretend for you because that's what you want from me. I don't want to pretend. Could
You
you
don't
not
have
run an absolute parallel with just normal stuff? This is you,
Yeah.
rather than a character.
Yeah, so there will be the option to do that.
As I say, not dumb
And it
down,
will be
but
very
just
structured
not
as well.
pretend.
Yeah, yeah.
Autistic people don't like to lie. They don't know how to formulate that. They will do it to please you, rather than saying, no, I don't want to do that.
Which is
because that's
why I
not
want to do lots of rounds of the kind of piloting, because I think we need to get that feedback over and over again from lots of young people.
Hi everyone, Sarfraz again from Autistic Hounslow. I think I know quite a lot of you. So just a few things. I've left some, well, at least a few left. So we support adults with learning